Welcome to the Day in History for March 27th. Today is the day that the construction of the transatlantic pipeline begins. Now, the big idea for today is that oil has become a fundamental human need. Now, a long time ago, and we talked about this in class when we did the fundamental human needs lessons, oil wasn't like super essential to human society, but today, oil is so important that we use it just about every single day. Well, we do use it every day. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about oil and a little bit about the pipeline. Okay, here we go. Now, we are in Alaska and we're going to look at the transatlantic pipeline. Now, there's not a whole lot up in Alaska. There's a lot of wonderful, beautiful wilderness, but there's also a ton of natural resources. So let's keep going. Here we go. Now, crude oil can be used in many different ways. And when we get oil straight out of the ground, you can't just take that oil out of the ground and stick it in your car or power your house with it. You need to refine it. You need to change it. And there's an entire system that we have called refining that does that. I thought about talking about refining, but we would have got off topic really quick. But here's just some of the things that we take crude oil straight from the ground, and turn it into. We turn it into asphalt for our roads. We turn it into liquid gas. We turn it into jet fuel. We turn it into gasoline, diesel fuel, and even heating oil. I'll bet you some of you have old places in your house where there were these giant barrels of oil. They used to actually heat our houses with oil like that. Some people still do it. Okay, now, if we look at the countries in the world that use a lot of oil, do you see who's number one? Yeah, that's America. China is up there as well, and then most of the other countries kind of fall into a similar level. But we use a ton of oil, so much oil. And so it's really important that we make sure that we have enough, because if oil stopped flowing today, if America all of a sudden didn't get any more oil, our trucks wouldn't run, and so our grocery stores wouldn't fill up. Our cars wouldn't run. A lot of our power plants would stop. The electricity would go off. We literally run on oil. Now, we are coming up with some other ways to make energy on the side, but we're still really dependent upon oil. Now, my hope is that as your generation grows up, we really focus more on like solar and wind and water and all kinds of other power. But that's a different topic as well. So, now, you might be asking yourself, Mr. Coughlin, why is there a picture of a war in the transatlantic pipeline day in history? Well, this war that happened in 1973, called the Arab-Israeli War, started a problem. Now, America supported Israel, and I'm not going to get into the details of the war. If you'd like to do more research on the war, it'd make a great follow-up research topic. But pretty much what happened is America supported Israel, and some of the other countries that didn't support Israel got a little upset with us. They also got upset with Japan and a few other countries as well. And so what these countries did is they started raising the price on oil, and then even started an oil embargo. Now, an embargo is when you just kind of say, we're going to stop giving this to you. And what happened was all of a sudden, our prices of oil in America went really high, and we started to run out of oil. So the countries that did this we call OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Remember, export means to give out. And so these countries realized they could use their power by having all this oil shipped to America and these other countries to get us to do things that we didn't necessarily want to do. So what happened in America, though, is this. We ran out of gas. Could you imagine going to the gas station and there not being any gas, or they say you can only get 10 gallons or 5 gallons of gas? It would make people a little bit worried. They had lines that went down the road. And it scared America. So we had to think of a way to solve this problem. Oh, doesn't that look nice? Doesn't that look like a great place to go camping? Well, in Alaska, there were a lot of natural resources, and it was a really, really nice place. This is pristine, beautiful wilderness. And there had been discussions before 1973 about building a pipeline all the way across Alaska to get to the oil that was way up north. Now, in Purdue Bay, which is way up north on the top of Alaska, they found an amazing supply of crude oil. There was so much oil. And the oil companies, who like to make money and they like to supply oil, really wanted to get this oil. But it was really difficult to get to. And so they had to think of a way to do it. And there were some ideas, and there were some pretty crazy ideas. One of the ideas was to build giant airplanes that you could fill the airplanes with oil and fly it down, because it was so far away from the rest of the country. They needed to find a way to get this oil. Airplanes wouldn't work. They even talked about building special submarines that could go under the ice. But that was too expensive too. And the way that they usually get oil down is on giant ships, like oil tanker ships. But the problem with Purdue Bay is that in the wintertime, for most of the year, the ocean freezes and you can't get there because it's covered in ice. And so they thought, well, what if we make special icebreaker oil tankers? And so they actually built one test icebreaker oil tanker, and it totally didn't work. It cracked on the side, it started flooding. It was a bad deal. And so they decided, you know what, we're going to have to build a pipeline. But it was going to be really, really long. Now, the pipeline that they built and that they started today is over 800 miles long. And it can move 2 million barrels a day, or up to 2 million barrels a day. It doesn't always go 2 million barrels a day. And the oil actually flows at like 3.7 miles an hour, which is kind of like about how fast you walk, like if you're walking pretty quick. But it wasn't as easy as just taking a pipe and putting it on the ground and then pumping oil through it. There was a lot of problems they had to overcome. Now, some of the engineering things they had to overcome was the fact that it was really cold and they had to make sure that the oil was warm enough to get through. Now, they call this one of the engineering wonders of the world, primarily because of all the problems that they ran into. Now, it gets really cold. When they were building this, it would get down to like negative 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That is super, super cold. And now, to be able to still work and build during this time, because they worked in the winter, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. They had thousands of people working on this. And they still had to build and engineer even in this really difficult climate. Now, first of all, they had to get the supplies there. So they actually had to build a road all the way up to Purdue. And so they built this highway so that they could then start building the actual pipeline. Now, one of the problems they ran into was permafrost. Now, permafrost is ground that is frozen year-round. Now, in Spokane, like if you go outside and it's winter, like the ground is going to freeze down to a certain point. Like if you try and dig in the dirt in the middle of winter, the ground's going to be frozen because there's moisture in it. The moisture freezes and the ground freezes. Now, when spring comes around, it warms up and the direct heat from the sun heats it up. It stores that radiant heat and then the ground's no longer frozen. But up north, like in Alaska, there's this land that never thaws. And so they call it permafrost. Now the problem is if you take a pipeline and you put oil that's heated up so that it can flow, it's going to melt the ground and the pipe will actually sink. And if you put it underground, then it'll melt the dirt around it and then the pipe will move and it will break. And you do not want a pipe to break when it's moving 20 or 2 million barrels a day. And there's 42 gallons in every barrel. So that's a lot of oil. Now, the solution they came up with was they actually raised a good portion of this pipeline off the ground with posts. And the posts had shock absorbers so that if there was an earthquake, it wouldn't break. They had these little things up on the top over here that would take some of the heat and let it off into the air. And the engineering was pretty amazing. They were able to get this pipe off the ground for the most part so that even caribou, another animal, could walk below it. So, pretty interesting. Now, let's go to the next slide. There were some concerns. Now, before 1973, the oil companies had tried to build this pipeline, but there was a lot of people that did not want it to happen. And they didn't want it to happen for a few reasons. They didn't want oil companies taking the beautiful Alaskan wilderness and ruining it with these pipes and the possibility of an oil leak, because there's been lots of oil leaks throughout history, and they're always really, really, really nasty. And so could you imagine if you lived in an area and then all of a sudden an oil company who probably doesn't care a whole lot about you decides to send a pipe through that might break and spew oil all over your favorite hiking spot? That'd be pretty sad. Well, what the government made the oil companies do is something called a environmental impact statement, which means the oil companies had to actually study, and the American government had to actually study the effects of a pipeline going through Alaska. And so they did this huge report that figured out all the problems that they might have, or a lot of the problems they might have, and ways to fix them. And that's why they came up with some of the amazing engineering designs to make sure this pipe didn't break. Now, there's still problems here and there. There's been some reports of minor leaks. There's actually even been people that have went by and shot the pipeline with a gun, and oil like shoots out the side. I was going to put a picture of that in there, but I couldn't find any pictures that weren't like really small. So if you want to look up bullet holes in Alaskan pipeline, like it's pretty crazy. Somebody shot it and like oil is just like shooting out the side. So there was a lot of environmental concerns because oil is a pretty nasty substance, but it's also something that runs our country. We need oil. Oil is like, right now, it's like the food for our country. Now, my hope is that in the future, we can find something different for our country to eat for energy, but right now, this is what we eat. Now, the pipeline was a success. It's still being used. There's other pipelines that are being built as well. And just about every single pipeline has a group of people that, for very good reasons, don't want them on their land. Because anytime you have a pipe that's built by humans, putting oil through it, there is a chance that it could break. And if it breaks, that is a lot of oil that can spill. But it's something we need. So, today's day in history is the day that the construction of the transatlantic pipeline began. See you guys on Monday.